Have you ever wondered what made medieval people laugh? Here's a joke that's been passed down to us from 13th century France. One night, the queen is drinking wine and playing a truth-telling game with her court. Lords and ladies, knights, dames, and jesters. The whole medieval setup. When it's her turn to pose a question, the queen turns to a nearby knight and asks, "Tell me, sir, have you fathered any children?" The knight goes red in the face and admits that he hasn't, and that's a pretty embarrassing thing for an adult man to admit in the Middle Ages, when birth control wasn't really a thing. It could mean he's not capable of having children, it could mean his wife won't go to bed with him, and he can't convince any other women to take her place. Since she's several drinks into the evening, and feeling herself, the queen decides to push the knight's buttons. She says, "You do not have the look of a man who could please his mistress when you hold her naked in your arms. For your beard is little more than the kind of fuzz that ladies have in certain places, and it is easy to tell from the state of the hay whether the pitchfork is any good." So the knight got roasted pretty good. But as it turns out, he had a nasty little comeback of his own, which we'll share at the end of the video. It proves that medieval people weren't all religion and hard work. They had a sense of humor way more similar to our own than we might think. In fact, many of the things people commonly say about the Middle Ages aren't true. By the end of this video, I hope you'll have a brighter view of these so-called Dark Ages. Maybe the biggest myth about the medieval world is that everyone died young. The average life expectancy of the Middle Ages is in the 30s, and this is true. But that's completely misleading for one simple reason. Average doesn't always tell the story. For example, if you and I were alone in a room and I had 1 million and you had nothing, our average net worth would be $500,000, even though neither of us actually has that amount in our pocket. It's a completely misleading picture. In reality, plenty of people in medieval times lived past 30. You just had to be healthy. And get lucky. The challenge was surviving childhood. Since medicine and hygiene were basically non-existent, many babies died during childbirth or shortly thereafter. Their immune systems just can't defend them. Even if you survived birth, the medieval world was a dangerous place to be young. Records suggest a third of children passed away before they were 1, and half of all people died before they were 10. To compensate for this, families had lots of children. Kids were needed to help around the farm or business and assist in taking care of their younger siblings. Childhood was a dangerous time, to be sure, but if you lived to be 10, your life expectancy was around 60. Another myth about the Middle Ages is that everyone married at a disgustingly young age. Often people say this is because of the low life expectancy. This one is a bit complicated. The further back in history we go, the sketchier the record. Most marriage documents from medieval times are from the nobility or royalty. Materials documenting noble or royal marriages were important, therefore, they would be preserved. This is how the myth of young marriages in the Middle Ages developed. The elite often married their children off at younger ages. The legal marriage age minimum in many European societies was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Wealthier and more influential families were focused on economic and societal advantages of marrying. Common people were in no position to marry very young. Boys had established a reliable source of income, as well as an independent household, prior to winning a wife. You had to be able to support a family. Many boys would have to wait until they completed a trade apprenticeship, or until their inheritance was passed down. Although girls couldn't often establish independence, they had to work too. In the High Middle Ages, women tended to marry around 20, and men in their mid to later 20s. So it's not like everyone was getting married in grade 7. Another myth is that medieval people were much shorter than people living today because they had poor diets. This is shockingly untrue in 2 ways. The myth comes from low door frames in medieval homes and castles. But the doors weren't low because people were tiny. Smaller doors and windows, as well as low ceilings, trap heat better, essential in winter. Without modern heating systems, societies turned to adapting their architecture. You can even see this technique in buildings built as late as the 20th century. Researchers who've studied the skeletons of medieval people have found they were shorter on average, but only by a few millimeters. Also, the idea that medieval people didn't get enough to eat is laughable. They ate like horses, 4,500 to 6,000 calories per day. For comparison, the average person in 2025 consumes about 2,900 calories per day. It makes sense when you think about it. In the past, most people did intense manual labor that required them to eat like professional athletes. With all that hard work and no running water, you might think medieval people were, well, dirty. After all, they were living in the land before toilet paper, but medieval hygiene may actually surprise you. They didn't like smell any more than we do. In some places, laws were even passed to mandate consistent bathing, as it benefited the community. The church especially encouraged bathing, as an individual with poor hygiene could be accused of the cardinal sin of sloth, basically being too lazy to bathe. Public bathhouses were places of social gathering, and also offered basic health services, such as lancing boils. Fancy private baths were uncommon, because it was hard work gathering and heating water. But people could always use rivers to bathe and do laundry, and they did. Speaking of water, it's often claimed medieval people had to drink beer or wine because their water was so dirty. Actually, clean water wasn't that hard to find. Towns had basic plumbing, using gutters and trenches to redirect waste. This protected the town's water source, often a central well. Alcohol wasn't a replacement for water, as today, people mostly drank it for fun. Yes, medieval people did have fun. And they did have a sense of style too. The tattered brown tunic is found in many depictions of medieval life, as though everyone looked terrible all the time. But they didn't. Dyes were available to people of all classes. Not every piece of clothing was colorful, because dyeing clothes was a lot of work. You had to do things like finding plants to make dye. Work clothes which would get dirty more easily weren't often dyed, but social and leisure clothes were very colorful. Certain colors like purple were much harder to get, and thus more expensive. So they were more available to nobility and royalty than the common person. But medieval people liked to pop, and you can see this in art from the time. So why have all these myths of uncleanliness, lack of resources, and death accumulated specifically around the Middle Ages? The medieval era is often associated with a specific period called the Dark Ages, which began with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. Trade was greatly reduced, the population declined, and the inability to import food meant that cities shrank and more people had to work the land. That meant less writing, less construction, and less art. These occurrences led to the belief that this period was violent and devoid of anything worthwhile. But the Middle Ages was filled with new inventions, including the mechanical clock, eyeglasses, and even the printing press at the end of the era. Universities were established, and classical Greek works were translated into Latin. This concept of the Dark Ages was invented during the Renaissance, a time in which scholars and artists mimicked ancient Greece and Rome and looked down on the Middle Ages. That attitude has kinda stuck around. But there was one thing about the medieval world that was completely false, and that's the idolization of knights and their supposed code of chivalry. In fairy tales, the honorable knight saves the troubled princess, defends the weak, and is the prime example of good. However, much of this image comes from those fairy tales and fantasies, and far less from reality. A prime example of this misconception is found during the Crusades, in which knights were encouraged to fulfill their duty to God, which meant converting people to Christianity by force. Knights pilfered and burnt down villages, murdered innocent people, and looted areas of conquest. Knights were like enforcers of the feudal order. Most of their job was doing what they were told by the lords or kings they served. And most of that was killing, extorting, and exploiting people. So, if the perfect good knight isn't real, where did this idea come from? From medieval people themselves. Chivalric romance stories about dashing knights and maidens in distress were popularized by bards at medieval courts. Modern people have helped too. The fake 10 Commandments of Chivalry were written in 1884 by French historian Léon Gautier, based on what he thought were chivalric rules from his reading of medieval romance literature. Chivalric knights, the defenders of the weak, the poor, the good, and your heart, never truly existed. Chivalry was interpreted differently by the knights of the Middle Ages, and in their eyes, they succeeded. But to us, they were anything but chivalrous. Speaking of nasty knights, it's time to finish the joke we started in the intro. The queen is basically playing 20 questions with her entourage. She asks the knight if he has any children. Ashamed and embarrassed, he admits he does not. The queen mocks him by saying, "You do not have the look of a man who could please his mistress when you hold her naked in your arms, for your beard is a little more than the kind of fuzz that ladies have in certain places, and it is easy to tell from the state of the hay whether the pitchfork is any good." The kind of joke about a man's endowment you might find in, well, YouTube comment section. According to the joke, the knight decides to be less than chivalrous and get the queen back. When it's his turn to ask a question, he says, "Lady, answer me without deceit. Do you have hair in that certain place you mentioned?" Unfazed, the queen replies, "None at all, sir." The knight laughs and raises his goblet and says, "Indeed, I do believe you, for grass does not grow on a well-beaten path." There you have it, a 13th century joke. A woman insulting a guy's manhood, a man attacking a woman's chastity. We've really come a long way as a species, haven't we? We may have cars and planes and high-speed internet, but we really don't have much new material. On the bright side, people in the Middle Ages took more baths than we thought, so that's a positive. And it's easy to find someone who does that nowadays too. So while the Middle Ages may no longer match our imagination, we can still enjoy a fictional medieval world inside a book or movie. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more interesting history facts, make sure to like and subscribe to the History Snob channel, and we'll see you in the next video.